Tonight we open pages that were meant to burn forever. Not pages of heresy or blasphemy, but something far more dangerous to those who built their empire on a single story. Hidden in the deepest vaults of the Vatican lies evidence of a Jesus you were never meant to know about. A figure so radically different from the one preached from pulpits that his true teachings would collapse 2,000 years of institutional power overnight. For centuries, the Catholic Church has maintained the most successful cover-up in human history, not about scandals or corruption, but about truth itself. The real Jesus, the man who walked the earth 2 millennia ago, bears almost no resemblance to the sanitized Savior they've sold to billions. His actual words, his revolutionary teachings, his true mission, all of it systematically erased, rewritten, and buried beneath layers of doctrine designed to serve those in power rather than set humanity free. But here's what they never anticipated. Some books survive burning. Some truths refuse to die. Hidden in forgotten monasteries, sealed in desert caves, encrypted in ancient languages they thought no one would ever decode. The real story of Jesus has been waiting in the shadows for over 1,500 years. This isn't about attacking faith. This is about reclaiming it from those who perverted it. Because if you knew what Jesus actually taught, if you understood the revolutionary message they've spent centuries burying, you would realize that everything you've been told about Christianity is a carefully constructed lie designed to keep you controlled, dependent, and ignorant of your true spiritual power. Like this video, subscribe, because tonight we're going where no documentary has dared to venture, into the forbidden archives where the real Jesus waits to be rediscovered, where the truth that could free humanity lies chained behind Vatican walls. Brother Thomas Aquinas had been a Vatican librarian for 23 years when he found the book that would cost him everything. It was a Tuesday morning in March 2019, and he was cataloging recently acquired manuscripts in the restricted section of the Vatican secret archives when his fingers touched something that shouldn't exist. A complete Gospel of Jesus, written in his own hand. The manuscript was unlike anything Thomas had ever encountered. The parchment was ancient. Carbon dating would later confirm it to be nearly 2,000 years old, but it showed none of the wear that should have accompanied such age. The ink seemed to shimmer with an inner light, and the Aramaic text was written in a script so precise it appeared to have been carved rather than penned. But it wasn't the physical properties of the document that sent ice through Thomas's veins. It was the content. This wasn't the gentle shepherd of Sunday school stories. This wasn't the willing sacrifice who meekly accepted crucifixion for humanity's sins. The Jesus described in these pages was a revolutionary teacher who spoke of human divinity, who taught techniques for accessing higher states of consciousness, who claimed that every person possessed the same divine spark he carried. Most shocking of all, he explicitly rejected the concept of worship, declaring that anyone who bowed before him had fundamentally misunderstood his message. "I am not your Savior," one passage read in Thomas's trembling translation. "I am your brother, showing you what you already are. The kingdom of heaven is not a place you go when you die. It is a state of consciousness you can access right now. Stop looking to the sky for salvation and look within yourself for the God that has always been." There, Thomas read through the night, his excitement growing with each page. Here was evidence that Jesus had taught a form of Enlightenment philosophy that predated Buddhism by centuries. He spoke of reincarnation as a natural law, of consciousness as the fundamental force of creation, of direct spiritual experience that required no intermediary, no priest, no institution. He taught his followers meditation techniques, energy healing methods, and ways to communicate directly with what he called the Source. Never, God in the anthropomorphic sense, Christianity had developed dot by dawn. Thomas understood why this manuscript had been hidden. If the contents were authentic, they would obliterate the theological foundation upon which the entire Catholic Church had been built. The doctrine of original sin, the necessity of salvation through Christ, the authority of priests to mediate between humanity and the divine, all of it contradicted by the man they claimed to represent. But Thomas also understood something else. This manuscript wasn't alone. Hidden throughout the Vatican archives were references to other problematic texts, documents that had been acquired, studied, and then sealed away. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which portrayed her as Jesus' spiritual equal and primary disciple. The Testament of Solomon, which described Jesus studying with mystery school teachers in Egypt and India. The Childhood Chronicles, which detailed Jesus performing impossible feats through what could only be described as advanced consciousness manipulation. Over the following weeks, Thomas began a careful investigation. Using his librarian credentials, he accessed restricted databases and cross-referenced acquisition records. What he discovered was evidence of the most systematic campaign of historical suppression ever undertaken. For over 1,500 years, the Vatican had been hunting down and destroying every document that contradicted their official version of Jesus' life and teachings. The pattern was consistent. Whenever early Christian communities developed interpretations of Jesus' message that emphasized personal spiritual empowerment over institutional authority, their texts were confiscated and burned. The Gnostic Christians who taught that salvation came through knowledge rather than faith saw their entire library system destroyed. The Essenes, who preserved Jesus' original teachings about consciousness and energy work, were scattered and their manuscripts seized. Even mainstream Christian scholars who asked uncomfortable questions about discrepancies in the official Gospels found their work suppressed and their careers destroyed. But the Vatican had made one crucial mistake. In their zeal to eliminate contradictory evidence, they had also preserved samples of it. Deep in their secret archives, locked away from public view, were the very documents they had spent centuries trying to erase. Thomas realized he wasn't just looking at hidden manuscripts, he was looking at proof of the greatest cover-up in human history. The Jesus manuscript contained a passage that seemed written specifically for this moment. They will build temples in my name and claim to speak for me. They will demand worship of the messenger while ignoring the message. They will use fear to control what I died to liberate. But truth is like water. It always finds a way through the smallest crack in the strongest wall. Thomas photographed every page, uploaded the files to secure servers in multiple countries, and prepared to release information that would shake Christianity to its foundations. But before he could act, his access was revoked. His Vatican apartment was searched, and he was transferred to a remote monastery in the Italian countryside where internet access was forbidden and communication with the outside world was strictly controlled. The official story was that Brother Thomas had suffered a nervous breakdown due to the pressure of his scholarly work. The unofficial story, whispered among Vatican insiders, was that he had discovered something that certain powerful figures wanted to remain hidden. The truth, as Thomas had learned, was far more dangerous than either version suggested. From his isolation in the monastery, Thomas could only watch as the world continued to worship the false version of Jesus the Vatican had created. But he had planted seeds that would eventually grow into something the Church couldn't control. Copies of the manuscript were already circulating among scholars who shared his hunger for historical truth. The real Jesus was beginning to emerge from the shadows where he had been hidden for nearly 2 millennia. And in Vatican City, certain officials were having emergency meetings about what to do when the public learned that everything they thought they knew about Christianity was a lie carefully constructed to serve those in power rather than set humanity free. The Jesus manuscript had survived burning once. The question was whether it would survive what was coming next. 6 months after Brother Thomas's disappearance from the Vatican archives, Dr. Sarah Chun received an encrypted email that would forever change her understanding of Christian history. As a professor of early Christianity at Oxford University, she had spent 15 years studying the gaps and inconsistencies in the official gospel accounts. What she hadn't expected was evidence that those gaps were deliberately created. The email contained high-resolution photographs of ancient manuscripts, along with a detailed analysis of Vatican acquisition records dating back to the 4th century. The sender identified himself only as a friend of truth, but the scholarly precision of the documentation suggested someone with intimate knowledge of Vatican archival systems. What Dr. Chun found in those files revealed a suppression operation so vast and systematic that it made the burning of the Library of Alexandria look like a footnote. The Vatican hadn't just destroyed contradictory texts about Jesus, they had built an entire institutional framework dedicated to hunting them down wherever they appeared. The Inquisition, commonly understood as a campaign against heretics, had actually been a manuscript hunting operation. Under the guise of rooting out false doctrine, Vatican agents had systematically raided libraries, monasteries, and private collections across Europe, confiscating and destroying any document that portrayed Jesus differently than the official Church narrative. The pattern was documented in meticulous detail. In 382 A.D., Pope Damasus I had commissioned St. Jerome to create the official Latin translation of the Bible, but the Vatican files revealed that Jerome had been given strict instructions about which sources to use and which to ignore. Dozens of earlier Gospels, many claiming apostolic authorship, were rejected not for historical inaccuracy, but for theological inconvenience. The Jesus they described was too powerful, too independent, too dangerous to institutional control. Dr. Chun studied a particularly disturbing document from the Council of Nicaea in 325 A.D. The council, she learned, hadn't just established the doctrine of the Trinity. It had also ordered the destruction of over 300 Christian texts that portrayed Jesus as a teacher of human divinity rather than a unique divine being. The Emperor Constantine himself had signed the destruction orders, declaring that no man should possess knowledge that makes him equal to the Christ we proclaim. But the Vatican suppression efforts hadn't ended with the establishment of official doctrine. Throughout the medieval period, They had maintained what they called the Orthodoxy Enforcement Division, a secretive branch of Vatican intelligence dedicated to monitoring Christian communities for signs of deviant interpretation. Whenever groups began developing practices that emphasized direct spiritual experience over priestly mediation, they were infiltrated, discredited, or eliminated. The Cathars of southern France had been wiped out not because they were heretics, but because they possessed copies of Jesus' original teachings about the illusion of material reality and the importance of inner spiritual work. The Knights Templar had been destroyed not for worshiping false idols, but because they had discovered in the ruins of Solomon's temple documents that proved Jesus had studied with Egyptian mystery schools and learned techniques for transcending ordinary consciousness. Even the Protestant Reformation, Dr. Chun realized, had been carefully managed by Vatican intelligence. While Martin Luther had been allowed to challenge Catholic authority on issues like indulgences and papal power, any reformer who questioned the fundamental story of Jesus himself had been systematically eliminated. The Vatican had learned that it was better to control religious rebellion by channeling it in acceptable directions rather than trying to suppress it entirely. The modern era had brought new challenges. As literacy spread and archaeological discoveries began unearthing early Christian texts, the Vatican had been forced to develop subtler methods of suppression. They couldn't simply burn books anymore, but they could control academic access to them, fund scholars who supported official interpretations, and discredit researchers who asked uncomfortable questions. Dr. Chun found evidence of a Vatican program called narrative maintenance that had been operating since the 1950s through carefully placed grants, endowments, and research positions. The Vatican influenced Christian scholarship at universities worldwide. Professors who produced work supporting traditional interpretations of Jesus found their careers advancing rapidly. Those who challenged orthodox views discovered that funding became difficult to secure, publication opportunities dried up, and academic positions became mysteriously unavailable. The program had been remarkably successful. Despite the discovery of texts like the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945, which contained multiple Gospels portraying Jesus as a teacher of gnosis rather than a sacrifice for sin, public understanding of Jesus had remained largely unchanged. The alternative texts were studied by a small circle of specialists but never integrated into mainstream Christian education or popular understanding. But Dr. Chun also discovered evidence that the suppression system was beginning to fail. Digital technology had made it impossible to control information as tightly as in previous centuries. Scholars around the world were beginning to connect fragments of evidence that the Vatican had spent centuries keeping separate. Translation software was making ancient texts accessible to researchers who didn't have specialized linguistic training. Most dangerous of all, some Vatican insiders were beginning to leak information that exposed the scope of the cover-up. The anonymous email that had reached Dr. Chun was part of a larger movement of Vatican whistleblowers who had decided that the truth about Jesus was too important to remain hidden. They called themselves the Libertas Christi, the freedom of Christ, and they possessed access to documents that could rewrite Christian history overnight. One of the most explosive files detailed the Vatican's response to the Dead Sea Scrolls discovery in 1947. The scrolls contained multiple references to a teacher called the Righteous One, who matched the description of Jesus but was portrayed as one of many enlightened teachers rather than a unique divine figure. The Vatican had immediately moved to control access to the scrolls, funding the excavation and ensuring that translation work was limited to scholars who could be trusted to downplay any material that contradicted official church doctrine. But some of the scroll material had been copied before Vatican control was established. Hidden in universities and private collections around the world were fragments of text that revealed Jesus as part of a larger movement of consciousness teachers who had been working to elevate human spiritual awareness. These teachers had developed techniques for accessing higher states of consciousness, healing through energy work, and communicating with what they called the light beyond form. The Vatican files revealed that similar suppression efforts had been undertaken with every major archaeological discovery that threatened official Christian narrative. The Gnostic Gospels found at Nag Hammadi, the early Christian text discovered in Ethiopia, the Aramaic manuscripts uncovered in Syrian monasteries, all had been either acquired by the Vatican or had their significance minimized through carefully orchestrated academic campaigns. Dr. Chun realized she was looking at evidence of a conspiracy that spanned nearly 2 millennia. The Jesus worshipped by billions of Christians bore almost no resemblance to the historical figure who had actually lived and taught in first-century Palestine. The real Jesus had been systematically erased and replaced with a version that served the needs of institutional power rather than human spiritual liberation. As she prepared to publish her findings, Dr. Chun understood that she was about to become a target of the same suppression system that had silenced countless scholars before her. But she also understood that the truth about Jesus was finally becoming too large and too distributed to suppress. The real story of Christianity's greatest cover-up was about to emerge from the shadows where it had been hidden for almost 2,000 years. The question was whether humanity was ready to learn that the religion built in Jesus' name had spent centuries destroying his actual message. 3 days after Dr. Sarah Chun published her preliminary findings about Vatican suppression, her Oxford office was broken into. Nothing was stolen, but her computer had been accessed and her research files carefully examined. The message was clear. She was being watched. But what the intruders hadn't anticipated was that Dr. Chun had already decoded the most explosive material from the leaked Vatican archives and hidden copies in locations they would never think to search. Hidden in safety deposit boxes across 3 countries were translations of texts that would shatter everything the world believed about Jesus. The Gospel of Thomas, long dismissed by the Church as Gnostic heresy, revealed a Jesus who taught that the kingdom of heaven was a state of consciousness accessible to anyone willing to seek within themselves. If those who lead you say, "See, the kingdom is in the sky," then the birds of the sky will precede you, one passage read. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will be known. But even more shocking was the complete Gospel of Mary Magdalene, not the fragmentary version known to scholars, but a full manuscript that portrayed her as Jesus' primary disciple and spiritual equal. According to this text, Jesus had taught Mary techniques for accessing what he called the light of truth, methods for expanding consciousness that allowed direct communication with divine intelligence. The Gospel described detailed meditation practices, energy healing methods, and ways of perceiving reality that transcended ordinary sensory experience. The Vatican files revealed that Mary Magdalene had been systematically written out of Christian history, not because she was a prostitute, but because she was too powerful. She had been Jesus' chosen successor, the one to whom he had transmitted the deepest teachings about human spiritual potential. The early church fathers couldn't tolerate the idea of female spiritual authority, so they had destroyed every text that portrayed Mary as anything more than a repentant sinner. Dr. Chung found herself translating passages that read more like advanced consciousness research than traditional religious teaching. Jesus spoke of the human brain as containing dormant capabilities that could be activated through specific practices. He described techniques for healing that worked by manipulating what he called the energy body, a field of consciousness that interpenetrated physical matter. Most revolutionary of all, he taught that death was an illusion created by identification with the physical form, and that consciousness itself was eternal and indestructible. The body is a temporary vehicle for the spirit, one passage explained. When you learn to identify with the spirit rather than the vehicle, you understand that what you call death is simply the spirit discarding a worn-out garment. The fear of death keeps you trapped in limitation. The understanding of immortality sets you free to explore the full scope of your divine nature. These weren't the teachings of a man preparing to die for humanity's sins. This was a master teacher instructing advanced students in the nature of consciousness and reality. Jesus spoke of multiple lifetimes, of souls choosing physical incarnation to learn specific lessons, of the evolution of consciousness through experience across many dimensions of existence. The picture that emerged was of a cosmic educator working to accelerate human spiritual development. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was the Gospel of Judas, not the version released to the public in 2006, but a complete text that revealed Judas as Jesus' most trusted disciple. According to this account, the crucifixion had been a carefully orchestrated initiation ritual designed to demonstrate that consciousness could survive the death of the physical body. Judas hadn't betrayed Jesus. He had followed explicit instructions to ensure that the demonstration would be dramatic enough to impact human consciousness for centuries to come. You will be cursed by the other disciples, Jesus tells Judas in one passage, but you will rule over them all, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me. The text made clear that Judas understood what the other disciples did not, that Jesus' true nature was consciousness itself, temporarily inhabiting a physical form for teaching purposes. The Vatican files contained evidence that this version of the Judas Gospel had been discovered multiple times throughout history, and each time it had been suppressed with particular violence. The text was too dangerous because it revealed the crucifixion not as a sacrifice for sin, but as a demonstration of consciousness mastery. If people understood that Jesus had orchestrated his own death to prove that consciousness transcends physical existence, the entire foundation of Christian guilt and redemption would collapse. Dr. Chun also discovered texts that detailed Jesus' training before beginning his public ministry. The infancy gospel of Jesus, hidden for centuries, described his travels to Egypt, India, and Tibet, where he studied with masters of consciousness development. These teachers had recognized him as an advanced soul who had incarnated specifically to serve as a bridge between human and divine consciousness. In Egypt, he had learned the mysteries of death and resurrection from priests who had preserved ancient knowledge about the nature of consciousness. In India, he had studied with yogis who taught him techniques for manipulating the life force that animates all matter. In Tibet, he had worked with masters who showed him how to project consciousness beyond the physical body and communicate with beings existing in higher dimensions. The Jesus who returned to Palestine after these years of study was not the simple carpenter of church tradition, but a master teacher equipped with advanced understanding of consciousness, energy, and the fundamental nature of reality. His miracles weren't supernatural interventions, but demonstrations of natural laws that most humans had forgotten how to access. Walking on water became levitation through consciousness-directed manipulation of gravitational fields. Healing the sick became the correction of energy imbalances that manifested as physical disease. Multiplication of loaves and fishes became the materialization of matter through focused intention combined with understanding of quantum creation principles. Even resurrection became the demonstration that consciousness could reanimate matter after apparent death. But the most revolutionary teaching was Jesus' insistence that these abilities were not unique to him. "Greater works than these shall you do," he had promised his disciples. According to the suppressed text, he spent 3 years training his inner circle in the same techniques he had mastered, preparing them to carry on his work of human consciousness elevation. The early Christian communities had been mystery schools, not churches. They practiced meditation, energy work, and consciousness expansion techniques that Jesus had adapted from his years of study with Eastern masters. The goal wasn't worship of Jesus, but becoming like Jesus, awakening the same divine consciousness he had demonstrated. Dr. Chun realized she was reading the manual for human spiritual evolution that the Vatican had spent nearly 2 millennia trying to destroy. Every technique, every teaching, every method that could help humans access their true spiritual potential had been systematically eliminated from Christian practice and replaced with rituals that emphasized dependence, limitation, and fear. The real Jesus hadn't come to establish a religion. He had come to obsolete the need for religion by teaching humans how to access divine consciousness directly. The Vatican had taken his message of human empowerment and transformed it into a system of human control. They had turned the greatest teacher of spiritual independence into the cornerstone of spiritual dependence. As Dr. Chun prepared to release her translations to the world, she understood that she was about to trigger the greatest crisis in Christian history. But she also understood that the truth was already spreading beyond anyone's ability to contain it. In universities, monasteries, and research centers around the world, other scholars were reaching the same conclusions she had. The real Jesus was emerging from the shadows, and no amount of Vatican suppression could push him back into the darkness. The question was whether humanity was ready to meet the teacher they had been prevented from knowing for almost 2,000 years. Dr. Sarah Chun should have expected the phone call. But when it came at 3:17 a.m. on a Thursday, her blood still turned to ice. The voice on the other end was calm, educated, with a slight Italian accent that made every word sound like a carefully considered threat. "Dr. Chun, my name is Monsignor Alessandro Toretti. I represent certain interests within the Holy See that are concerned about your recent research directions. I believe we should meet to discuss how your work might be redirected toward more constructive purposes." The call had come just 12 hours after Dr. Chun had submitted her manuscript on the suppressed Jesus text to the Journal of Early Christian Studies. Someone with access to academic peer review systems had known about her submission almost immediately. The reach of Vatican influence was more extensive than she had imagined, but Dr. Chun had been preparing for this moment. Over the past months, as her research had delved deeper into forbidden territory, she had been building connections with other scholars who were asking similar dangerous questions. They called themselves the Historical Truth Coalition, and they had developed secure communication methods and mutual protection protocols specifically for researchers whose work threatened established religious narratives. Through encrypted channels, she learned that Vatican suppression operations had evolved far beyond the crude methods of previous centuries. The modern church couldn't simply burn books and execute heretics, but they had developed subtler and arguably more effective techniques for controlling dangerous information. Cardinal Marcus Velluti ran what Vatican insiders called the Department of Doctrinal Harmony, ostensibly a theological research division, but actually an intelligence operation that monitored academic institutions worldwide for threats to Orthodox Christian interpretation. The department maintained files on thousands of scholars, tracking their research interests, funding sources, personal relationships, and potential vulnerabilities. When a researcher's work began threatening established doctrine, the department deployed what they called influence interventions. These could range from academic pressure, funding cuts, conference rejections, peer review manipulation, to personal harassment designed to discourage or intimidate. In extreme cases, they had been known to use methods that bordered on persecution. IRS audits, visa problems for international scholars, even orchestrated academic scandals that destroyed careers overnight. Dr. Chun discovered that several prominent biblical scholars who had challenged traditional interpretations of Jesus had experienced mysterious setbacks. Professor Hans Weinberg at the University of Berlin had lost tenure after publishing research suggesting Jesus had studied with Buddhist teachers. Dr. Fatima al-Rashid at Cairo University had been forced to retract papers about pre-Christian mystery schools after her family received death threats. Professor James Morrison at Harvard Divinity School had suffered a complete nervous breakdown following the suppression of his work on Gnostic Christianity. But the Vatican's most powerful weapon was information warfare. Through a network of friendly media outlets, sponsored scholars, and social media influence operations, they could flood public discourse with content that discredited dangerous research before it gained traction. Any scholar who challenged the official Jesus narrative would find themselves facing a coordinated campaign of professional and personal destruction. Dr. Chun realized she was facing an organization that had spent nearly 2 millennia perfecting the art of suppressing inconvenient truths. They had survived the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, and the digital age by adapting their methods while maintaining their core objective, ensuring that the version of Jesus that served institutional power remained the only version the public ever encountered. The Historical Truth Coalition had been documenting these suppression efforts for years. It possessed evidence of Vatican funding reaching major universities, publishing houses, and media organizations worldwide. The scope was breathtaking, a global network of influence that could shape public understanding of Christian history while appearing to be completely independent of church control. But they had also discovered something that gave them hope. The suppression system was beginning to break down. Digital technology had made information too fluid to control completely. Social media allowed direct communication between researchers and the public, bypassing traditional gatekeepers. Most importantly, Vatican secrecy had created its own vulnerability. When their suppression efforts were exposed, they generated far more attention for the suppressed information than it might have received. Otherwise, the coalition had developed what they called the Streisand Protocol, a coordinated release strategy that used Vatican suppression attempts as proof of the importance and authenticity of suppressed information. When the Vatican moved to silence a researcher, the coalition would immediately publicize both the research and the suppression effort, creating a narrative that the Church was trying to hide crucial historical truth. Dr. Chun found herself at the center of the first major test of this strategy. Her research on the forbidden Jesus texts was about to be simultaneously released by scholars in 12 countries, making it impossible for Vatican influence operations to suppress the information through traditional means. The translations would be published in multiple languages, distributed through academic networks, and backed up on secure servers worldwide. But the personal cost was becoming clear. Dr. Chun's marriage was under strain from the stress and secrecy surrounding her research. Her children were asking questions about why their phone was tapped and why strangers sometimes followed them to school. Her elderly parents in Hong Kong had been contacted by men claiming to represent academic integrity organizations who asked detailed questions about their daughter's mental health and professional conduct. The psychological warfare was sophisticated and relentless. Dr. Chun received anonymous packages containing photographs of her daily activities, entering her office, buying groceries, picking up her children. No explicit threats, just a clear message that she was being watched constantly. Her email was flooded with messages from fake colleagues expressing concern about her recent instability and suggesting she seek psychiatric help. Professional websites began publishing articles questioning her scholarly credentials and suggesting her research was motivated by anti-Christian bias rather than historical interest. Most disturbing were the attempts to manipulate her perception of reality. Research materials would disappear from her office and reappear days later in different locations. Computer files would be subtly altered, dates changed, names misspelled, footnotes deleted, creating doubt about her own memory and organizational abilities. Phone conversations would be interrupted by strange sounds and voices that made her question whether she was experiencing technical problems or surveillance. The gaslighting campaign was designed to achieve what physical persecution could not, making Dr. Chun doubt the validity of her own research and the stability of her own mind. If she could be driven to question her perceptions, she might abandon her work voluntarily or discredit herself publicly through seemingly irrational behavior. But Dr. Chung had learned from the experiences of other targeted scholars. She documented everything, maintained multiple backup systems, and stayed in constant communication with coalition members who could verify her experiences and provide emotional support. Most importantly, she understood that the intensity of the suppression campaign was itself proof of the revolutionary nature of what she had discovered. The Vatican wouldn't deploy such extensive resources against research. That was merely academic speculation. They were treating her work as an existential threat because they understood something that most scholars missed. Public knowledge of the real Jesus would not just change religious understanding, it would transform human consciousness itself. The Jesus revealed in the forbidden texts wasn't just a different interpretation of Christian doctrine. He was a teacher of human transformation whose methods, if widely understood and practiced, would render religious institutions obsolete. He had taught techniques for accessing divine consciousness directly, eliminating the need for priestly mediation. He had demonstrated that death was an illusion, undermining religions based on afterlife rewards and punishments. Most dangerously, he had shown that every human possessed the same divine nature he embodied, destroying hierarchies based on spiritual authority. As Dr. Chun prepared for what she knew would be the most dangerous phase of her research, she understood that she wasn't just challenging religious doctrine, she was threatening the fundamental power structures that had controlled human civilization for 2 millennia. The Vatican's desperate suppression efforts were the actions of an institution that understood it was fighting not for theological correctness, but for its very survival. The real Jesus was about to emerge from nearly 2,000 years of imposed obscurity. The question was whether the institutions built in his name would survive the encounter with the teacher they had worked so hard to hide. The coordinated release began at exactly midnight GMT on March 15, 2024, in 12 universities across 6 continents. Scholars simultaneously published Dr. Sarah Chun's translations of the forbidden Jesus texts. Within hours, the suppressed Gospels were available in 17 languages on secure servers that had been distributed across the globe to prevent single-point suppression attempts. The Vatican's response was swift but chaotic. Cardinal Velluti's Department of Doctrinal Harmony had prepared contingency plans for individual researcher suppression, but they had never faced a coordinated international release of this magnitude. Their influence networks, designed to control academic discourse through careful pressure on key individuals and institutions, proved inadequate against a decentralized information campaign that bypassed traditional gatekeepers entirely. Dr. Chun watched from a safe house in rural Scotland as the world began to grapple with revelations that struck at the foundation of Christian belief. The Gospel of Thomas, with its emphasis on inner spiritual discovery, was trending on social media platforms in dozens of countries. Video lectures by coalition scholars were accumulating millions of views as people hungry for spiritual truth discovered teachings that had been hidden from them for nearly 2 millennia. But the most explosive reaction came from the complete Gospel of Mary Magdalene. For the first time in history, the public could read Jesus' actual instructions for consciousness development, detailed meditation practices, and techniques for what he called awakening the divine spark within. The text revealed a Jesus who taught human empowerment rather than human dependence, who saw his role as showing others how to access the same divine consciousness he embodied. Religious communities worldwide were fracturing as members discovered that the Jesus they worshipped had taught ideas that directly contradicted church doctrine. Progressive Christians embraced the revelations as confirmation of their belief in direct spiritual experience. Traditional believers struggled to reconcile the new texts with lifelong faith commitments. Many simply rejected the evidence entirely, clinging to familiar interpretations despite mounting historical proof of their inadequacy. The Vatican's official response was predictable but revealing. Pope Francis issued a statement calling the texts elaborate forgeries designed to undermine faith, while simultaneously refusing to allow independent carbon dating or linguistic analysis that could verify their authenticity. Vatican scholars, Published, papers attacking the credentials of coalition, researchers without addressing the actual content of the discovered texts. But behind the public denials, Dr. Chun's sources within the Vatican revealed panic at the highest levels. Emergency meetings of the College of Cardinals had been convened to address what they privately called the greatest threat to church authority since the Reformation. Internal memos leaked to coalition researchers showed Vatican officials acknowledging the authenticity of the texts while desperately seeking ways to minimize their impact on church doctrine. Cardinal Velluti had been reassigned from suppression, efforts to what Vatican insiders called damage control and narrative reconstruction. His new mandate was not to hide the texts. That was no longer possible, but to frame them in ways that preserved institutional authority. The strategy involved acknowledging the texts as interesting historical artifacts, while insisting they represented misguided interpretations of Jesus' true message rather than authentic teachings. This approach required the Vatican to perform increasingly desperate theological gymnastics. They argued that Jesus had been experimenting with different teaching methods during his ministry, and that the suppressed texts represented preliminary ideas he had later abandoned in favor of the doctrines preserved in official Gospels. They claimed that Mary Magdalene, despite being portrayed as his primary disciple in multiple texts, had misunderstood his teachings and recorded them inaccurately. The intellectual dishonesty was transparent to anyone examining the evidence objectively. The suppressed texts were consistent with each other across multiple authors and time periods, suggesting a coherent teaching tradition that had been systematically eliminated rather than naturally superseded. Moreover, the complexity and sophistication of the consciousness techniques described in the texts indicated advanced understanding rather than primitive experimentation. Dr. Chun found herself at the center of a global media storm as news organizations struggled to understand the implications of the revelations. Interviews with major networks provided opportunities to explain how the real Jesus differed from church orthodoxy, but they also exposed her to renewed suppression efforts from Vatican supporters. The attacks on her credibility intensified as the impact of the revelations became clear. Anonymous websites appeared claiming she had fabricated the translations. Social media accounts spread rumors about her mental health and professional competence. Academic journals that had previously accepted her work began rejecting submissions without explanation. but something unexpected was happening. The very intensity of the suppression campaign was generating more attention for the suppressed texts than they might have received through normal academic channels. People who had never heard of early Christian studies were downloading and reading the forbidden Gospels because they wanted to understand what the Vatican was so desperate to hide. Religious institutions found themselves facing questions they had never expected to address. Seminary students demanded to know why they had never been taught about texts that revealed Jesus as a teacher of human transformation rather than divine sacrifice. Parish priests struggled to explain why the Church had hidden teachings that emphasized direct spiritual experience over institutional mediation. The crisis deepened as practicing Christians began experimenting with the consciousness techniques described in the suppressed Gospels. Meditation groups formed around Jesus' actual instructions for inner spiritual work. Energy healing circles developed based on methods Mary Magdalene had recorded. Prayer groups shifted from petition-based worship to the contemplative practices Jesus had taught his inner disciples. These developments terrified Vatican leadership because they represented exactly what the suppression had been designed to prevent. Christians discovering that they could access divine consciousness directly without need for priestly mediation. The forbidden texts weren't just challenging church doctrine, they were making church authority irrelevant by teaching people how to experience the divine for themselves. Dr. Chun received reports from coalition researchers documenting what they called spontaneous spiritual awakening among people who practiced the techniques revealed in the suppressed texts. Individuals with no previous meditation experience were accessing expanded states of consciousness. People dealing with terminal illnesses were experiencing healing through the energy work methods Jesus had taught. Most significantly, practitioners were reporting direct communication with what they described as divine intelligence, the same phenomenon Jesus had called communion with the light beyond form. The Vatican faced an unprecedented crisis. For nearly 2,000 years, they had maintained authority by positioning themselves as the exclusive bridge between humanity and the divine. The suppressed texts revealed that Jesus had actually taught the opposite, that every person could access divine consciousness directly, and that external religious authority was not just unnecessary but counterproductive to genuine spiritual development. Internal Vatican documents leaked by Libertas Christi revealed discussions about controlled partial disclosure, acknowledging some aspects of the suppressed texts while maintaining institutional interpretation of their significance. Cardinal advisors suggested that the Church could adapt by repositioning itself as the authentic interpreter of newly revealed teachings rather than the exclusive mediator of divine grace. But even this compromised position was becoming untenable as more people discovered that the consciousness techniques worked exactly as described in the forbidden texts. When individuals could heal through energy work, communicate with divine intelligence directly, and access expanded awareness through meditation practices Jesus had taught, they no longer needed religious institutions to validate their spiritual experiences. Dr. Chun realized she was witnessing the beginning of a transformation that went far beyond academic historical revision. The real Jesus was emerging from nearly 2 millennia of imposed obscurity, and his actual teachings were beginning to catalyze the same kind of consciousness expansion he had worked to achieve during his historical ministry. The question was no longer whether the Vatican could suppress the truth about Jesus. That battle had been lost the moment the texts were released globally. The question was whether religious institutions built on the false version of Jesus could adapt to the reality of the teacher they had worked so hard to hide, or whether they would be rendered obsolete by the very figure they claimed to represent. The revolution Jesus had begun 2,000 years ago was finally reaching the people who had been prevented from hearing his message. The real question was whether humanity was ready for the transformation he had always intended to inspire. 6 months after the global release, Cardinal Marcus Velluti stood before the assembled College of Cardinals in the Sistine Chapel, delivering what many believed would be the Vatican's final response to the crisis that threatened to destroy 2 millennia of church authority. The cardinals who filled the sacred space looked haggard, their faces bearing the weight of an institution under siege from the very figure it claimed to represent. "Your Eminences," Velluti began, his voice echoing off Michelangelo's frescoes, "we face an unprecedented threat to the unity of the faith. These ... documents are spreading faster than we can contain them. Traditional suppression methods have not only failed, but have amplified public interest in the heretical materials. The numbers were devastating. Church attendance had dropped by 40% in countries where the suppressed texts were widely available. Seminary enrollments had plummeted as prospective priests questioned whether their calling was based on authentic spiritual guidance or institutional propaganda. Most alarming, Catholic universities worldwide were reporting that theology students were abandoning traditional doctrine in favor of the consciousness practices revealed in the forbidden Gospels. Dr. Sarah Chun, monitoring Vatican communications through Libertas Christi sources, learned that the Church was preparing what they called Operation Restoration, a final attempt to regain control of the narrative before their authority collapsed completely. The plan involved unprecedented measures that would expose the Vatican's true priorities to the world. The first phase was already underway, a global media campaign that portrayed the suppressed texts as part of an international conspiracy against Christianity. Vatican-funded organizations were producing documentaries, books, and social media content claiming that the texts had been fabricated by secular humanists, Islamic extremists, and New Age cultists working together to destroy traditional faith. The campaign deliberately avoided addressing the actual content of the texts, instead focusing on attacking the motives and credibility of anyone who promoted them. But the second phase revealed the Vatican's desperation more clearly. Internal documents showed plans to declare the suppressed texts as demonic deceptions and to threaten excommunication for any Catholic who studied or practiced the teachings they contained. For the first time in modern history, the Vatican was prepared to explicitly forbid its members from engaging with materials allegedly written by Jesus himself. The theological implications were staggering. The Church was essentially arguing that Jesus, if he had indeed written or inspired these texts, had been wrong about his own nature and mission. They were claiming that their interpretation of Jesus was more reliable than his own documented teachings. It was a position so obviously self-serving that even loyal Catholics began questioning the institution's spiritual authority. Dr. Chun found herself receiving reports from around the world documenting the growing schism within Christianity. Progressive churches were embracing the suppressed texts and incorporating the revealed consciousness practices into their services. Traditional congregations were fragmenting as members chose between institutional loyalty and spiritual authenticity. New spiritual communities were forming around the actual teachings of Jesus, often led by former priests and nuns who had left the church to pursue the path he had actually taught. The most significant development was occurring in monasteries and convents where religious life had supposedly preserved the deepest Christian traditions. Monks and nuns who dedicated their lives to following Jesus were discovering that their institutions had prevented them from accessing his real teachings for their entire careers. Many were experiencing what they described as spiritual awakening as they began practicing the meditation and consciousness techniques revealed in the suppressed Gospels. Brother Marcus, a Benedictine monk from Bavaria, became a symbol of this transformation. In a video that received millions of views worldwide, he described how practicing Jesus' actual teaching methods had given him direct experience of the divine consciousness Jesus had called the light beyond form. The contrast between his radiant spiritual presence and the defensive posturing of Vatican officials was stark and undeniable. For 30 years, I sought God through prayer, study, and service, Brother Marcus explained. But it was only when I learned Jesus' actual techniques for consciousness expansion that I discovered what he meant when he said the kingdom of heaven is within. The church taught me to worship Jesus. Jesus taught me to become like him. Similar testimonies were emerging from Christian communities worldwide. People who had practiced traditional Christianity for decades were experiencing more profound spiritual transformation in months of following the suppressed teachings than they had achieved in lifetimes of conventional religious practice. The evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Jesus' actual methods worked in ways that church substitutes did not. Vatican theologians found themselves in an increasingly untenable position. They could not deny the effectiveness of the practices revealed in the suppressed texts without implicitly acknowledging that their own methods were inferior. They could not dismiss the texts as inauthentic without explaining why the Vatican had spent centuries acquiring and preserving them. Most problematically, they could not argue that Jesus had been wrong about his own teachings without undermining the foundation of Christian doctrine. Entirely. The third phase of Operation Restoration revealed the Vatican's final desperation. Cardinal Velluti had authorized what internal documents called direct intervention, attempts to physically prevent the spread of the suppressed texts through measures that bordered on terrorism. Coalition researchers documented systematic cyber attacks on websites hosting the texts, arson attempts at printing facilities producing translated versions, and even physical assaults on scholars who had participated in the Revelation Project. But these tactics backfired spectacularly. Each attack generated international media coverage that brought the suppressed text to the attention of millions who might never have encountered them otherwise. The Vatican found itself in the impossible position of appearing to use violence to suppress teachings about love, consciousness, and human spiritual potential. Dr. Chun realized she was witnessing the death throes of an institution that had outlived its purpose. The Vatican had served a role in preserving Christianity during periods when direct spiritual teachings were too dangerous to share openly. But the suppressed texts revealed that Jesus had always intended his followers to transcend dependence on external authority and access divine consciousness directly. The most profound change was occurring among ordinary people who began practicing the consciousness techniques Jesus had taught. Reports flooded in from around the world of spontaneous healings, expanded awareness, and direct spiritual experiences that confirmed the reality of the divine consciousness Jesus had described. People were discovering that they didn't need priests to mediate their relationship with the divine, because they could access that relationship directly through the methods Jesus had provided. The implications extended far beyond religious practice. Practitioners of Jesus' consciousness techniques were reporting enhanced creativity, improved health, greater emotional balance, and expanded perception of reality itself. They were beginning to demonstrate the same kinds of abilities Jesus had exhibited, not as supernatural miracles, but as natural expressions of human potential when consciousness was properly developed. As the first anniversary of the global revelation approached, Dr. Chun found herself reflecting on how completely the landscape had changed. The Vatican still existed, but its authority had been fundamentally undermined by the emergence of the figure it claimed to represent. Traditional Christianity was fragmenting as believers chose between institutional loyalty and authentic spiritual practice. Most significantly, Jesus himself was finally free to teach humanity the lessons he had come to share 2,000 years earlier. The suppressed texts had revealed that Jesus had never intended to establish a religion based on worship of his person. He had come to demonstrate human divine potential and to teach methods for accessing that potential directly. The Vatican had spent centuries turning his message of empowerment into a system of dependence, his teachings about consciousness into rituals of submission. But truth, as Jesus had taught, could not be suppressed forever. Despite nearly 2 millennia of institutional opposition, his real message was finally reaching the people he had come to serve. The question was no longer whether the Vatican could maintain control of the Jesus narrative. That battle had been decisively lost. The question was whether humanity was ready to embrace the transformation that Jesus had always intended to catalyze. The real Jesus was no longer hidden behind Vatican walls. He was teaching again directly to anyone willing to learn, just as he had always planned to do. 2 years after the global revelation, Dr. Sarah Chun stood before the United Nations General Assembly in New York, addressing world leaders about what historians were already calling the most significant transformation in human spiritual consciousness since the birth of organized religion. The woman who had once hidden translations in safety deposit boxes was now presenting evidence to international leaders about how the emergence of authentic Jesus teachings was reshaping global society. Distinguished delegates, Dr. Chun began, we gathered today not to discuss politics or economics, but to address a transformation that transcends national boundaries and affects every aspect of human civilization. The rediscovery of authentic early Christian texts has catalyzed what can only be described as a consciousness revolution that is fundamentally altering how our species understands its own potential. The statistics she presented painted a picture of unprecedented global change. In the 2 years since the suppressed texts had been released, Over 200 million people worldwide had begun practicing the consciousness techniques Jesus had actually taught. Universities were establishing new departments of applied consciousness studies to research the practical implications of methods described in the forbidden Gospels. Medical schools were incorporating energy healing techniques into their curricula after repeated demonstrations of their effectiveness. But perhaps most significantly, crime rates had dropped by an average of 60% in communities where substantial numbers of people practiced Jesus' authentic teachings. Mental health indicators showed dramatic improvements. Environmental restoration projects led by practitioners of consciousness techniques were achieving results that conventional methods had never approached. The transformation wasn't just spiritual. It was practical, measurable, and globally beneficial. The Vatican, meanwhile, was collapsing as an institution. Pope Francis had resigned 18 months earlier, citing irreconcilable differences between institutional requirements and spiritual authenticity. His successor had lasted only 6 months before acknowledging that the Church could not maintain its authority while simultaneously suppressing the teachings of the figure it claimed to represent. Cardinal Velluti had been among the last Vatican officials to abandon the suppression campaign in a final desperate attempt to maintain institutional control. He had organized what he called the Council of Doctrinal Restoration, a gathering of conservative church leaders from around the world who pledged to reject the authentic Jesus teachings regardless of evidence supporting their validity. But even this last bastion of resistance had crumbled when Brother Thomas Aquinas, the Vatican librarian who had first discovered the hidden Jesus manuscript, emerged from his enforced isolation with even more explosive revelations. During his time in the remote monastery, Thomas had gained access to archives that contained the Vatican's complete records of their suppression campaign dating back to the 4th century. The documents Thomas revealed showed that Vatican officials had always known the authentic nature of Jesus' teachings but had made a calculated decision to suppress them in favor of a version that served institutional power. Internal correspondence between 4th century church fathers explicitly discussed how Jesus' actual message of human empowerment would make religious authority obsolete, and how a modified version emphasizing dependence and submission would better serve their political objectives. The evidence was damning and undeniable. Popes throughout history had written private letters acknowledging that they were perpetuating teachings they knew contradicted Jesus' actual message. Cardinals had documented their strategies for suppressing authentic spiritual practices in favor of rituals that reinforced institutional control. The Vatican had spent nearly 2 millennia knowingly teaching a false version of Jesus' message, while hiding his real teachings from the people who needed them most. The revelations triggered what media outlets called the Great Awakening, a global movement of people abandoning traditional religious institutions in favor of direct spiritual practice based on Jesus' authentic teachings. Churches emptied as congregations dissolved, but this didn't lead to spiritual abandonment. Instead, new communities formed around the consciousness practices Jesus had actually taught, led by individuals who had experienced direct transformation through his methods. Dr. Chen found herself documenting transformations that seemed miraculous, but were becoming increasingly commonplace. People with terminal illnesses were healing through the energy work techniques described in the suppressed Gospels. Individuals suffering from depression and anxiety were finding profound peace through the meditation practices Jesus had taught his inner circle. Most remarkably, practitioners were developing what could only be described as expanded human capabilities, enhanced intuition, telepathic communication, and the ability to influence physical matter through focused consciousness. These developments were causing fundamental shifts in multiple fields of human knowledge. Physicists were revising theories about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to physical reality. Psychologists were incorporating Jesus' teachings about the infinite potential of human awareness into therapeutic practices. Even economists were studying how communities practicing authentic Christian consciousness techniques achieved unprecedented levels of cooperation and resource sharing. The transformation extended to international relations as well. Countries with large populations of people practicing Jesus' authentic teachings were reporting dramatic decreases in internal conflict and increased capacity for peaceful resolution of disputes with neighboring nations. The consciousness techniques Jesus had taught seemed to naturally dissolve the fear-based thinking that drove most human conflict. Religious scholars were calling it the second coming, not the return of Jesus as a physical person, but the return of his actual teachings to a world that had been deprived of them for nearly 2 millennia. The Jesus who emerged from the suppressed texts was more revolutionary than any political leader, more transformative than any technological innovation, and more practical than any economic system. But the most profound change was in how humans understood their own nature. Jesus' authentic teachings revealed that what people called miracles were actually expressions of natural human capabilities when consciousness was properly developed. Death was revealed not as an ending, but as a transition between states of being. Suffering was shown to be primarily a result of identification, with limited aspects of identity rather than recognition, of infinite spiritual nature. The Vatican's theological claim that humans were fundamentally flawed beings requiring external salvation was exposed as a control mechanism designed to maintain institutional power. Jesus' actual teachings revealed humans as divine beings temporarily experiencing physical existence for the purpose of consciousness evolution. The difference between these perspectives was literally the difference between spiritual slavery and spiritual freedom. Dr. Chun's UN presentation concluded with a question that was reshaping human civilization. If Jesus came to teach us that we are divine beings capable of miraculous transformation, that death is an illusion, and that the kingdom of heaven is a state of consciousness we can access right now, what does that mean for how we organize our societies, educate our children, and plan our future as a species? The answer was emerging through the transformed communities sprouting up around the world. Educational systems were being redesigned around consciousness development rather than information accumulation. Healthcare was shifting from treating symptoms to addressing the spiritual and energetic causes of disease. Governance was evolving toward consensus-based models that reflected the interconnected awareness Jesus had taught. 3 Vatican cardinals remained in Rome, maintaining the basic administrative functions of what had once been the world's most powerful religious institution. But their authority extended little beyond the Vatican walls. The Catholic Church, as it had existed for nearly 2 millennia, was dying. In its place was emerging something far more aligned with Jesus' actual intention, a global community of humans awakening to their divine nature and learning to express it through consciousness-based living. The suppressed texts had revealed that Jesus had never intended to establish a religion based on worship of his person. His mission had been to awaken humanity to its own divine potential and provide practical methods for accessing that potential. The Vatican had perverted his message of empowerment into a system of control, his teachings about consciousness into rituals of submission, his demonstration of human divine nature into a doctrine of human unworthiness. But truth, as Jesus had taught, could not be suppressed forever. After nearly 2,000 years of institutional opposition, his real message was finally transforming human civilization in the way he had always intended. The consciousness revolution he had begun was finally reaching critical mass, catalyzing the species-wide awakening he had come to inspire. The greatest irony was that the institution built to represent Jesus had become the primary obstacle to understanding his actual message. But that obstacle had been removed, and humanity was finally free to learn directly from the teacher who had been hidden behind Vatican walls for almost 2 millennia. 5 years after the first suppressed gospel was leaked from the Vatican archives, Dr. Sarah Chun stood in what had once been St. Peter's Basilica, now converted into the global center for consciousness studies. The magnificent architecture remained unchanged, but the purpose had been transformed completely. Where once crowds had gathered to worship a distant Savior, researchers and practitioners now came to study the consciousness techniques that Jesus had actually taught. The transformation of Vatican City itself symbolized humanity's emergence from 2 millennia of spiritual misdirection. The Sistine Chapel had become a meditation center where people practiced the contemplative methods described in the authentic Jesus texts. The Vatican secret archives were now fully open to researchers worldwide, their contents serving as a historical cautionary tale about the dangers of institutional control over spiritual truth. Dr. Chun's role had evolved from academic researcher to something closer to what ancient traditions might have called a wisdom keeper. She spent her time documenting the continuing transformation of human consciousness as more people learned to practice the methods Jesus had developed for awakening divine awareness within ordinary human experience. The statistics told a story that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. Over 800 million people worldwide now practice some form of the consciousness techniques revealed in the suppressed Gospels. Crime had virtually disappeared in communities where substantial numbers of people had developed expanded awareness. Mental illness rates had plummeted as people learned to identify with their eternal spiritual nature rather than temporary emotional and psychological fluctuations. But the most remarkable change was in human capability itself. What previous generations had called miracles were becoming increasingly commonplace as people learned to operate from expanded states of consciousness. Healing through directed intention was now taught in medical schools. Telepathic communication was being studied by neuroscientists as a natural human ability that emerged when consciousness was properly developed. Even what people once called impossible phenomena levitation, materialization, and consciousness projection were being documented and researched as expressions of human potential that Jesus had demonstrated and taught. The educational implications were staggering. Children born after the revelation were displaying natural access to expanded awareness that previous generations had to develop through years of practice. They seemed to intuitively understand the interconnected nature of consciousness and matter that Jesus had described in his teachings. Schools were being redesigned around consciousness development rather than information accumulation, producing young people who combined intellectual brilliance with spiritual wisdom in ways that humanity had never before achieved systematically. The economic transformation was equally profound. Communities practicing Jesus' authentic teachings had naturally evolved toward what economists called consciousness-based resource sharing systems where individual and collective needs were met through cooperative intention rather than competitive accumulation. Scarcity had become virtually unknown in these communities, not because resources were unlimited, but because consciousness-directed cooperation made abundance available to everyone. International relations had been revolutionized as well. Nations with large populations of consciousness practitioners found themselves incapable of maintaining the fear-based thinking that drove most global conflict. Diplomatic disputes were resolved through methods that emphasized understanding rather than domination. Military expenditures had dropped dramatically as countries discovered that genuine security came from consciousness development rather than weapon accumulation. Dr. Chun found herself reflecting on how completely wrong the Vatican had been about the implications of Jesus' authentic teachings. Church leaders had suppressed his message because they feared it would eliminate the need for religious authority. They had been correct about that consequence, but entirely wrong about its significance. The elimination of external spiritual authority had not led to chaos or moral decline. It had led to unprecedented levels of human cooperation, creativity, and compassion. The consciousness techniques Jesus had taught worked by helping people recognize their fundamental interconnectedness with all life. When individuals experience themselves as expressions of unified divine consciousness temporarily, focused through individual personalities, they naturally acted with consideration for the well-being of everyone and everything around them. External moral authority became unnecessary because people spontaneously chose actions that served the highest good of all. This transformation extended to humanity's relationship with the natural world as well. Practitioners of Jesus' consciousness techniques reported direct experiential understanding of their connection to the Earth's ecosystem. Environmental restoration projects led by consciousness-developed individuals achieved results that purely technological approaches had never matched. Climate change itself was being addressed through methods that combined practical environmental action with consciousness practices designed to heal humanity's relationship with the natural world. The scientific implications were perhaps the most revolutionary. Researchers studying consciousness practitioners were documenting phenomena that required fundamental revisions of scientific understanding about the nature of reality itself. The consciousness Jesus had taught people to access appeared to operate according to principles that transcended the physical laws science had previously considered absolute. Quantum physicists were discovering that consciousness was not an emergent property of complex matter, but rather the fundamental force from which matter itself emerged. Medical researchers were documenting healing through methods that worked by addressing the consciousness patterns underlying physical symptoms. Even engineers were developing technologies that operated through consciousness-matter interaction rather than purely mechanical principles. But perhaps the most significant change was in humanity's understanding of death itself. Practitioners of Jesus' authentic teachings were reporting direct experience of consciousness continuity beyond physical death. Terminal illness was no longer feared as an ending, but understood as a transition between states of being. Grief remained when loved ones died, but it was tempered by experiential knowledge that consciousness itself was indestructible. Dr. Chun often received visitors who wanted to understand how the world had changed so completely in such a short time. The answer was always the same. Humanity had finally gained access to the instruction manual for its own consciousness, written by a teacher who had mastered the principles he taught and demonstrated their practical application through his own life and death. Jesus revealed in the suppressed texts had not been a unique divine being requiring worship, but rather an advanced human being showing others what they themselves could become. His miracles had been demonstrations of natural human capabilities when consciousness was properly developed. His teachings had been practical instructions for accessing the same expanded awareness he embodied. Most importantly, his entire mission had been to awaken humanity to its own divine nature. The doctrine of human sinfulness and unworthiness that had dominated Christianity for nearly 2 millennia had been revealed as a complete perversion of his actual message. Jesus had taught that every person was a divine being, temporarily experiencing physical existence for the purpose of consciousness evolution. The Vatican's suppression of this message had delayed human spiritual development by almost 2,000 years. But it had not prevented the ultimate emergence of the truth Jesus had come to share. Consciousness, like water, had eventually found its way through even the most carefully constructed barriers. As Dr. Chun walked through the transformed spaces of what had once been the seat of institutional Christianity, she reflected on the irony that the building dedicated to honoring Jesus had finally become a place where his actual teachings were studied and practiced. The greatest tribute to his life and mission was not worship of his person, but the flowering of human consciousness he had always worked to inspire. The suppressed text had revealed that Jesus' final words had not been a cry of abandonment, but a declaration of completion. It is finished. His work of planting the seeds of human consciousness transformation had been accomplished. The suppression that followed had delayed the harvest, but it could not prevent the eventual flowering of the seeds he had planted. Humanity was finally growing into the divine potential Jesus had recognized and worked to awaken. The kingdom of heaven he had spoken of, the state of consciousness, where human and divine nature merged in perfect harmony, was no longer a distant promise but a present reality being experienced by millions of people worldwide. The real Jesus had finally been freed from the prison of institutional interpretation. His actual teachings were transforming human civilization in exactly the way he had intended. After nearly 2,000 years of hiding behind Vatican walls, the greatest teacher in human History was finally able to complete the work he had begun in first-century Palestine. The consciousness revolution was no longer a possibility. It was the new reality of human existence. And it was only the beginning.